Okay, everyone, we are now recording officially. Hello, welcome everyone to this first Friday faculty colloquium, no longer at noon, but at 11. We're crossing several teaching times, and so we thought the box lunch idea would work fine. That way, if you're hungry, you can eat, or if it's your only opportunity, and if you need to take it with, you can also do that. So. I want to call your attention, you have little flyers there about the lineup this semester, and one of the reasons we have Robin standing up here isn't just because she's a very generous dean with her time and interest in introducing these two amazing faculty, but also because she came up with the idea of our having something that had to do with public scholarship. So you'll notice in this semester's lineup, we have people who are doing kind of work that has applicability, or that what we might call engaged research, and so applicability beyond our bluff, and the healthy city is one, the public intellectual. And then President Tim Snyder jumped at the opportunity. I was really quite pleased to hear that he has a number of papers and items in progress, and he would love the faculty to hear about this. That is some of the scholarly side and aspects of his work. So Robin Crabtree, I introduced to you, she'll introduce the speakers today, and you know a great deal about her, but if you don't, she's in her second year, having now, I think Fairfield is a distant memory for her. I hope. And even more distant, my alma mater, New Mexico State, where Robin had her beginning of her career, her academic career. So I'm very pleased that Robin Crabtree is able to be here with us, and an otherwise very busy week to introduce these wonderful people, and welcome all of you. Yay.
So thanks so much. A lot of times we bemoan the loss of intellectual community when we leave our doctoral programs where our lives are lived in seminars, where we're reading and engaging ideas in depth with colleagues who are as passionate as we are, where ideas are fresh and transformative for us. And then we hit the realities of faculty academic life, which is balancing so many responsibilities, and that sense of intellectual community can so easily feel lost. And these opportunities, I think, are critically important for engaging with each other as scholars, and feeling a little sense of what it is to be part of primarily intellectual community, and an opportunity to learn new things, engage new ideas, and so on. The issue of public scholarship, I think, is critically important because as education is under assault, and liberal arts education in particular, ensuring that our scholarship is patently apparent in its usefulness to society is very, very important. If you're reading the Chronicle of Higher Education, if you're reading other higher education press, you're hearing a lot of the call back to relevance and back to a stronger public mission for higher education, and particularly scholarship. We've done so much to engage students in community, but our own scholarship really also needs to be useful to community, to policy questions, and so on. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Who's going first? All right, so I'll begin with Rebecca Sagar. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. Her doctorate is from University of Arizona, another good Southwestern university. Her latest book, Faith, Politics, and Power, The Politics of Faith-Based Initiatives, intersects with the topic of her talk today. What else do I want to say? We talk a lot about interfaith initiatives here at LMU and in UCLA's strategic plan. Interfaith dialogue is a big one, and I think it's important that we remember part of that is also the dialogue between faith-based traditions and secular traditions. So I think Rebecca's talk and work are particularly important in that regard. Professor Tom Ward is an assistant professor of philosophy, PhD from UCLA, And his areas are medieval philosophy, philosophy of religion, and metaphysics. And sometimes that seems far from the public sphere in how abstract and historical those topics can be. But his efforts are to connect his larger project, about God, morality, and modality, to contemporary thought. And so he will invite us into that conversation, and we're excited to be here with you. So first, Dr. Sagar.
Yay.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I just want to say I'm very happy I actually made it today because I didn't realize that we had changed the starting time until about 10 o'clock last night when I decided to double check my email. So I would have been here at noon, which would have been a little bit later than optimal if I hadn't done that. Anyway, thank you for coming. And so today I'm going to talk about what I'm calling, and this is actually a paper that I'm writing with two colleagues, what we call strategic alliances. And so these are faith-based and secular community groups working together to create successful partnerships. I think that this talk is, or this work, just kind of coincidentally happens to really fit in with what Pope Francis talked to us about yesterday and again this morning, which is how important it is for faith-based and political groups to try to achieve success on a number of different issues. And so this talk really looks at how and why these partnerships really work so well together, and also a couple of the distinct disadvantages that they do have when faith-based and secular groups do try to work together. So this part of the project is looking at faith-based community organizing groups. So these are different groups that work within communities to try to do a number of different things. Work on housing, work on food security, work on prison reform. And so my co-authors did a large study looking at a number of these different organizations across the whole country. And then my part was to think about how one of those groups in particular, which is PICO, People in Communities Organizing, showed or illustrated why these groups can work so well together. So this is actually part of a larger project for me, which looks at the role of Catholic organizations and secular groups. And so this one is political organizing groups. I'm also looking at a relationship between a charitable organization and secular group, and then I'm hoping to figure out some way to kind of expand that to a business area. So, but this presentation specifically focuses on faith-based community organizing and political outreach and how effective they are with secular organizations. So, like I said, my part focused on LA Voice. Some of you may be familiar with LA Voice. LA Voice is the Los Angeles branch of PICO, which is a congregation-based community outreach group founded in 1972 by a Jesuit priest, Father John Bauman. In LA and actually across the country, they work on a variety of different initiatives, usually mostly community-based. So, you know, working with sheriff's departments to make sure a local drug house gets removed, working with grocery stores to make sure Boyle Heights has an actual grocery store and not just small markets for people to buy food in. And recently, in the last few years, they've actually branched out to working on large-scale political outreach. And what this means is registering voters, actually getting voters to the polls, and campaigning for particular initiatives. As a nonprofit, they can't campaign for candidates, right? But they can campaign for particular initiatives that they see as part of their overall mission. In Los Angeles, LA Voice has 19 member congregations, most of which are Catholic, but they are across a variety of different religious groups. And they've recently been partnering on these political initiatives with secular organizations to try to make sure that they are successful. because they've realized that really to be able to do these things that are much different than local organizing around opening grocery stores, registering voters and getting people out to vote is a very different task than making sure that a drug house is gone, right? So we did two types of research methods. First was both field research and interviews. I interviewed 17 key religious and secular activists that work with PICO and with other secular organizing groups in Los Angeles at two different times. So 2012, 2014, actually I finished or did most of the interviews last spring in spring of 2015. And then worked on these political campaigns with them in 2012 and 2014. I'm glad to talk more about what Proposition 30 is and Prop 47 at the end of the talk, but just briefly, Prop 30 was an initiative to increase taxes to fund education in 2012, and then Prop 47 more recently in 2014 was an initiative for prison reform, which was they changed what they called 6 wobblers, which were a DA could charge it either as a felony or a misdemeanor, and it made them all misdemeanors. And I don't know if you remember this, but both of these were actually successful. So they both passed in California. Prop 30 was actually the first tax increase that had passed in California in almost 30 years. So, and then Prop 47 was very significant, and it was the first of its kind to pass in the country. So my colleagues had collected additional data on 178 faith-based community organizing groups, 65% of whom had collaborated with secular organizations. And so they measured different levels of effectiveness, whether or not they were able to get media attention, whether or not they were able to have political influence, what their reputation was, and last, their mobilizing capacity. So, quantitative results, I can talk a little bit about this, but this is really the domain of my co-authors. But essentially what they found is that on almost all of these measures, the faith-based groups that worked with secular organizations were significantly more effective. They got significantly more media attention. They were able to meet not only more frequently, but with much higher level political officials. They had greater respect from other organizations, so organizations that self-reported, do you think that this is a good, quality, successful organization? If they partnered with secular groups, other organizations thought much higher of them. The one drawback is that they were able to actually get fewer numbers of people at specific events. So my job was to try to understand that, right? Why are these things happening? So they have this great data about what's happening, and so I was like, well, what is going on? What's happening on the ground that's making these groups generally much more successful, but sometimes not quite as successful? So what I found is that there were really two types of alliance formation with LA Voice and PICO. There were local level alliances, so LA Voice formed its own alliances with a number of different organizations in Los Angeles, but PICO also formed alliances with much higher level, state level groups. And that these groups then created a number of different ways that the organization was able to be successful. And just a quick note, not all of the alliances they tried to make did work out, which again I can talk more about later, but most of them did. So I argue, and this is where I'd actually love some input because we're finishing the paper right now and about to send it out to American Sociological Review, which is the kind of top journal in sociology. So if you have questions or thoughts or don't buy what I'm saying, I would love to get that feedback now before we send it out. So one of the reasons I argue is that they were really successful because of this mutually reinforcing benefits. So in other words, they offered benefits to each other that the groups didn't have on their own. For example, convening power. So they were able to get this convening power because on its own, PICO, which is a well-known organization, right? But California Calls and the teachers union, when they were working on Prop 30, that was going to be much more likely to get them a meeting with Governor Brown, which, as you can see right there, this is one of the PICO leaders meeting with Governor Brown, and they actually got together far before Prop 30 had even been really decided what the initiative would look like. And so they got in on that meeting to really say, this is what Prop 30 should look like. And so both the secular and religious leaders recognized that they offered tools to each other that they didn't have otherwise. So one of them said, I do think alliances are an incredibly good idea because, I think decision makers in our cities or communities don't expect to see these kinds of partnerships. Right? So most leaders, so they were talking about getting meetings with the mayor and the city council here with LA Voice and secular leaders, and this was a secular leader, and they were saying, most of these political people expect religious groups to come in on their own, or they expect community organizing groups to come in on their own. And when they're actually working together, this is really much more powerful and gets people's attention. Second, one of the main arguments we have is that media attention, there are two things happening. One is that diversity of crowds, so you have more different kinds of people, media is more likely to pay attention if there's a diversity of crowds, but also, as you probably noticed with the Pope's visit, if you have a religious leader out there saying a political message, then you're much more likely to get attention from the media because it brings something new and different. And so the secular leaders actually called this getting a caller to a media conference. So bringing someone in from a faith perspective to kind of show up and put legitimacy on what they were talking about. Number three, power equals respect, right? So this greater convening power translated into more respect from other faith-based groups. So they saw these groups getting more power, getting more media attention, able to achieve higher levels of things than they were just on their own, and so were able to generate respect. Finally, they could share skills. So a couple of things that the faith-based groups talked about why they worked with secular organizations is that these secular groups just frankly had more skills, right? They had political savvy that the faith-based groups didn't have. They had technical savvy the faith-based groups didn't have. So for example, PICO and LA Voice could never have done the voter engagement without California Calls. California Calls gave them all the predictive direct dialing equipment. California Calls trained them on how to do that. California Calls taught them how to map out territory. And so they just couldn't have gotten that without it. But when I talked to California Calls about why they were so happy to work with PICO and LA Voice, they said they add an element that's about telling a story and about telling a moral, faith-based story that we don't do. We're really good about talking about the numbers, right? Like we should pass Prop 47 because it's going to save us X millions of dollars. What they're really good is about putting a face on Prop 47 and why it's so important that we shouldn't lock up people in chains for their whole lives, right? So what they said is, we're smart enough to know that we're not the only show in town, and we believe that sharing intelligence and sharing knowledge, analysis, best practices, can only make us and build and strengthen us. Now, there was this one problem, right? So they weren't able to get as many people to specific organizing events. Now, what that means is if they held a rally about Prop 30, fewer people showed up than if it would have been just a religious group. So why? Well, there's two things. One, alliance building takes time away from organizing, right? If you're working with other people and constantly trying to make sure these alliances are working out, that takes time away from you spending time with your organizing leaders. Second, there's this kind of concern about cultural distillation. that if you're always working with different kinds of groups, then you're not paying as much attention to your own group and what it's supposed to look like. And finally, the last concern was that, and it's true, these were actually really short term. So they come together for a discrete period of time, and then the alliance would kind of fall apart, and then if they needed each other again, then they come together again. Now, all the groups I talked to actually mention this as a real problem. So for example, you have something like Prop 47, which, I don't know how much people know about this, but so there's these 6 wobblers, went from felonies to misdemeanors, and it's actually retroactive. So people who are currently in jail can apply to get out of jail. Now, so what's the problem with a short-term alliance? So you get this passed, but then you have to have the implementation, right? And so if you're all just working on it by yourselves all of a sudden again, then are you overlapping? Are you doing all the things that you were worried about doing when you started the alliance in the first place? So overall, we argue that the benefits of these religious secular alliances far outweigh those final costs, and that those costs are actually mostly can be remedied, right? That if these groups recognize that these alliances are short-term, but they should be more longer-term, that's something that can be fixed. If they recognize that they're not getting as many people to the events, then maybe they can focus some more attention on organizing. But overall, the costs were greatly mitigated by the power that they achieved through working together, which was passing these 2 huge statewide initiatives. They're actually doing another one in 2016 about possibly repealing Prop 13. Again, if you're familiar with California initiatives, it was a proposition in the early 1970s that's essentially been bankrupting California for a little over 40 years. So we'll see what happens in 2016. But as one of the secular partners said, I mean, the fact is, like, anyone that thinks we can skip over labor, skip over faith-based organizations, is really comfortably being the loyal opposition and not actually winning anything. So next steps, we're finishing this paper. It's going to be under review, and then I'm continuing on my own to look at these other charitable and possibly business relationships. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Tom, yeah, I'm wondering,
Questions after, right?
maybe questions after, right? And yeah, and Tom, you could mention the Academy for Catholic Thought and Imagination, which Brian Trainor was originally supposed to be here to speak to that. So I want to be sure that we don't miss that, because when he sees the recording, he's going to want to see that we've mentioned your
switch
fellowship.
The order of the talks.
Yes, that's true. So I'm so sorry, but
Well, let me say thank you to Brian Trainor and the Academy for Catholic for these fellowships and all the good work.
I second.
Yeah. So in the spirit of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, I'm going to talk about something as different as you could possibly imagine. A highly speculative theological talk. Right, so my project was on medieval theories of the relationship between God and morality as part of a broader project developing a theistic metaphysics of the nature of the possible and the necessary. And I labored on a manuscript for this talk which would situate my interest in the ethics stuff within the metaphysics project, that I just couldn't pull off anything that wasn't both deeply obscure and superficial. So I'm just going to stick to one aspect, the ethical side, and focus on the story of Abraham and Isaac, and how 2 medieval theologians, Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, interpreted it. So let me just begin by reading the relevant scripture from Genesis 22. God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," he said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." So the story is deeply disturbing. At first glance, God's a bully for demanding such a thing. Abraham's a maniac for consenting. And Isaac is a fool for not resisting. What's going on? Among the many different perspectives we could approach, from which we could approach the text, I want to look at its place in some medieval moral theorizing about the relationship between apparently naturally discernible moral norms and what God apparently can demand of us. The story had an important place in medieval moral theology because it seems to represent God as demanding that Abraham violate one of our most widely shared and deeply held moral judgments, that it is always wrong to kill the innocent on purpose. How can God demand such a thing of us? One sort of answer to the question is the one that comes from Immanuel Kant. God can't demand such a thing from us. Abraham had a moral obligation to refuse the perverse request. It couldn't possibly have come from God. On a more traditional understanding of the authority of Scripture, we're supposed to take the text at face value. The very same God who issued the 10 Commandments through Moses is asking Abraham to violate what would eventually become the 6th. Here is an obvious tension, an intellectual puzzle of existential importance to the Christian, Jewish, or Muslim believer. My title for the talk, "With God, Everything is Permitted," subverts the slogan Sartre attributed to Dostoevsky. From the section of Brothers K Sartre likely had in mind, it is not clear whether we're intended to think that Dostoevsky himself thought that morality depended on God, such that if God does not exist, there are no moral standards. But Sartre himself thought the conditional was true, thought the antecedent was true, and consequently that there are no moral standards, except those we arbitrarily and irrationally give to ourselves. Sartre's slogan is so famous because it's a pithy way of stating what many people think, believers and unbelievers alike. Many people do indeed think that morality, as it is commonly experienced, namely as a set of rules we are obligated to follow, whether or not we do follow them, and whether or not we feel like following them, depends on there being some supernatural or at least superhuman lawgiver, a role traditionally occupied by God, as God has been conceived in Western philosophy and theology. But it is only a slogan, and a very modern one. Both Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus would have rejected the idea that morality depends on God's existence. Both took Aristotle as a guide in ethical matters, a partial guide. Aristotle believed in God, albeit a God very different from the one Aquinas and Scotus worshipped. But Aristotle also thought that this God had nothing whatsoever to do with morality. Instead, Aristotle thought that we can discern good and bad, right and wrong, merely by reflecting on human nature. We human beings share the same human nature, and this nature has certain norms built in, as it were. This is most evidently seen in our shared physiology. We all agree that medical science is the science that is concerned with what it is for a human body to be healthy or unhealthy, along with what it takes to restore the unhealthy to health. A doctor has the knowledge and authority to declare how a human body ought to be, and to judge the degree to which this or that patient matches up to the standard of human physiological health. Similarly, for Aristotle, moral science, or ethics, is supposed to be that science which is concerned with what it is for a human being to be good or bad in thought and action. Aristotle's method in ethics is to consider the various capacities we human beings have simply in virtue of being human. Those capacities which Aristotle identified as most distinctively human, he attributed to an umbrella capacity which he called reason or rationality. Aristotle thought that we are right to judge a human being to be doing well or badly based on the extent to which it is actualizing or acting so as to actualize these rational capacities. What we call the vices are those habits which incline us to fail to actualize our full potential as human beings. The virtues, by contrast, are those habits which do incline us to actualize our full potential. Aristotelianism also has a lot to say about our conduct toward others, inasmuch as it recognizes that there are goods of community life in which our flourishing as individuals partly consists. Now, the main point to draw from the little summary of Aristotelian ethics is that for Aristotle, ethics is a perfectly natural enterprise. There's nothing mysterious or religious about it. Just as an expert gardener understands the conditions under which a rose bush flourishes and those under which it languishes, he knows, for example, what sort of soil the rose needs, how much sunlight and water, how much fertilizer and what kind, when and how to prune, etc. So too, the moral expert understands what a human being needs for its flourishing. To take a relatively trivial example, if you eat too much ice cream, you won't be well off as a person. If you have a habit of eating too much ice cream, we can say that you have a vice, a habit which inclines you to do what's bad for you. The moral expert understands. The moral expert understands just what role ice cream can play in a flourishing life. Just a little bit on an ordinary day, maybe a bit more at birthday parties and holidays.
Oh,
You're okay.
terrible.
Why are you picking on ice cream?
I'm lactose intolerant. So I can't enjoy it. Plays a very little role in my flourishing life. So if I were an atheist or agnostic, I'd be an Aristotelian about ethics and would be unmoved by Sartre. But here's a reason why even the atheist Aristotelian might be uncomfortable with a purely naturalistic ethics. Think of it as a potential problem of moral motivation. Suppose I came to stop caring about morality. Not that I became a moral skeptic, but simply that I stopped caring. I decide that I want a Don Juan sort of life. Morality and propriety be damned. It's hard to see what sorts of reasons could persuade me to continue the moral life. We should strive, I think, for an ethics which achieves not only universality, in the sense that everyone's under its claims, but also relevance, in the sense that everyone has good, compelling reasons to be committed to it. Naturalistic Aristotelianism achieves the goal of universality, since it derives morality from human nature. But it fails to achieve relevance, since it can't offer good reasons for being moral to the immoralist who understands the claims of morality and believes them, but is just not interested. So as a theistic alternative, consider a version of Aristotelianism about ethics which also holds that there is a God who is interested in moral judgment, with punishment or reward awaiting us all. On this theory, I would have a very compelling reason for at least attempting to conform to morality. A self-interested reason, sure, but a compelling one. We wouldn't think very highly of someone who cared for morality only out of fear of punishment. But all things considered, it's better, at least for the rest of us, for the would-be Don Juans of the world to act morally for base reasons. So on this theistic Aristotelianism, we could say that while the content of morality is determined totally by our human nature, there is an accountability to morality built into the system. And this accountability gives us the relevance we should be seeking in a moral theory. But it must be stressed what an impoverished view of God's relationship to morality we get if we focus only on fear of divine retribution as a reason to be moral. It's not just that this fear ultimately ought to play no role in a perfect moral life. Additionally, it seems pretty intuitive that actions motivated solely by fear aren't properly moral actions at all. So, having briefly looked at this one way in which God has traditionally been thought to play a role in morality, I'd like now to go deeper, inching closer to the troubling Bible story with which I began. Both Aquinas and Scotus, along with countless other medieval theologians, thought that the perfectly moral life, as envisioned by Aristotle, is not our final end as human beings. They all thought, paradoxically, that the ultimate goal of human life is something beyond the human. They thought, to continue the paradox, that all human striving, ineluctably, by nature, pursues a goal which it cannot possibly achieve. A perfect, loving relationship with God, which involves a union with God so intimate that many theologians and mystics have thought it appropriate to say that the glorified human being is deified, made divine by the union. This transcendent or supernatural goal of human life forces a critical examination of the role that morality is supposed to play in achieving this goal. Augustine's polemics banished Pelagianism from Western Christianity. We can't earn our salvation, we're dependent on divine assistance. It follows that even perfect success in the moral life, if this is possible, does not entail that we reach the supernatural end of union with God. Whatever role morality is supposed to play in getting us to our final end, it is nothing like a cause-effect relationship. Being moral cannot be the cause of our achieving our supernatural end, nor can it be anything like an economic transaction or contractual relationship if these were to imply any obligation on God's part to raise to glory those who reached moral perfection. And yet we find in the tradition, going all the way back to the New Testament, a very close connection between morality and achieving our supernatural end. Everyone thought that living a morally perfect life is, or should be, among the things we aim at as we aim at our supernatural end. St. Augustine made a great deal of sense out of this connection between morality and the supernatural end when he taught that the love for God ought to transform our earthly loves so that we love no finite thing for its own sake, but love every finite thing, including ourselves, ultimately for God's sake. In this way, the moral life is taken up into the mystical life and becomes a concrete, day-to-day way to habituate oneself to the loving relationship with God we hope eventually to enjoy. Medieval scholastic theologians are all Augustinians in this sense, but there were different and sometimes competing ways to flesh out the details. The story of Abraham and Isaac became an important focus of reflection on the relationship between morality and the religious life because it seems to reveal the possibility of this deep rift between the claims of morality and those of faith. It looks like God is asking Abraham to choose sides. Who's it going to be, me or morality? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas didn't read the story this way at all. Aquinas taught that the moral law, as discerned through reason, and as revealed in the Ten Commandments, was ultimately rooted in God's very nature, and as such, God has no choice over what the content of morality should be. And he cannot command anything contrary to morality, since this would be to act against his own nature. How then can he make sense out of our story? Aquinas argues that as a sinner, Isaac justly deserves the punishment of death. Moreover, it is the right of the sovereign to appoint any of his subjects as executioner. So Abraham is God's hangman, and Isaac is the convict. As Aquinas says, quote, "When Abraham consented to slay his son, he did not consent to murder, because his son was due to be slain by the command of God, who is the Lord of life and death. For he it is who inflicts the punishment of death on all men, both godly and ungodly, on account of the sin of our first parent. And if a man be the executor of that sentence by divine authority, he will be no murderer any more than God would be. Here Aquinas is obviously concerned to interpret the story in a way that leaves God blameless, but he is equally concerned to interpret it in a way that leaves morality changeless. God, it appears, respects the moral law and is obligated to follow it. He can't order the death of an innocent person. Where it appears that God did just that, we need to remember that everyone is a sinner and the wages of sin is death. So it would be unfair to Aquinas to say that he thinks God is under the moral law as we are. God cannot act against morality, but this is not because he is subject to morality, strictly speaking. Instead, it would be more right to say that he is morality. The moral law is simply the expression of the divine goodness in human affairs. Blessed John Duns Scotus read our story rather differently. He took it as evidence that God can indeed alter the moral law. For example, discussing whether any of the 10 Commandments could be revoked, Scotus sets up the following thought experiment. Imagine 2 acts of killing that are circumstantially the same, say a father killing his innocent son with a knife. Could God make one of these killings licit while leaving the other prohibited? And Scotus says, quote, "If God cannot cause one of these acts of killing to be no longer prohibited, then he cannot make killing licit. But that he did so is clear in the case of Abraham and in many other instances." Awkwardly expressing himself, as always, I wish Sister Mary Beth were here, Scotus's view at least is clear. We know that morality forbids actions like tying up your son and killing him with a knife. Abraham's intention to kill his son in just this way would ordinarily be straightforwardly condemned as an intention to murder. But Abraham is not morally guilty for intending this. What explains it? God told him to do it. But how would God's telling him to do it get Abraham off the hook? Only if God had the power to dispense Abraham from the moral law. Scotus's broader point in this and other texts is that nearly all of morality is subject to God's free will. And this is the big ethical difference between Scotus and Aquinas. For Aquinas, the moral law is ultimately settled by divine nature. For Scotus, it's ultimately settled by divine fiat. I want to make 2 clarifications now. First, when Scotus attributes to God the ability to revoke the moral law, he does not seem to be implying that there would be no morality at all without specific acts of divine commands and prohibitions. Instead, the view seems to be that morality, as naturally discernible by broadly Aristotelian methods, is always susceptible of a divine dispensation. Second, Scotus's God does not will haphazardly. Scotus, like Aquinas in this respect, believes that God is by nature loving and cannot do or will anything contrary to his loving nature. So how might Scotus counsel Abraham, trying to decide whether to obey the awful voice? Abraham, God's purpose for you and Isaac is to be perfected in the love of God. It is perhaps impossible for us to see how this action you are being commanded to perform will assist either of you along that path. This is why it's a test of your faith. You are being asked to trust that God is ordering your lives toward loving union with him. Okay, alternatively, how might Aquinas counsel Abraham? Abraham, you may not be able to see it, but your son Isaac is a sinner worthy of death. God wishes him dead and has appointed you to be his executioner. I know it's hard for you to see Isaac as worthy of death, and I know it's even harder for you to see why you are the one being commanded to execute him. This is why it's a test of your faith. You are being asked to trust that God is justly punishing a sinner. Well, in my own view, neither counselor is very comforting. In the Catholic intellectual tradition, Scotus is a perennial whipping boy. His belief that God is free to modify the moral law to suit his purposes is supposed to be one of his more egregious errors. Pope Benedict XVI, in his controversial Regensburg address, singled out Scotus as representative of a voluntarist trend in later medieval theology which divorced God's reason and will with a view of divine freedom according to which God, quote, could have done the opposite of everything he has actually done. And then it goes on. This might even lead to the image of a capricious God who is not even bound to truth and goodness. In the address, Benedict XVI attributes to this sort of voluntarism the sort of religious impulse which is prone to violence. It shouldn't be hard to see what the connection is supposed to be. Scotus's voluntarism implies that God has the authority to command people to do things contrary to naturally discernible morality, such as kill their own children. What's to stop him from commanding his chosen warriors from doing similar atrocities on a grand scale? Is everything permitted or potentially permitted with God? But is this worry about religious violence really peculiar to the voluntaristic tradition Scotus represents? Shouldn't we worry just as much about a view such as Aquinas's, according to which God may appoint anyone to be his executioner, and, by the way, everyone is guilty of a capital offense? Well, my own view is that if Scotus's views are going to be charged with fomenting religious violence, then Aquinas's should be too. But I can't take either charge very seriously. I suppose someone might sit down and read Scotus or Aquinas on the story of Abraham and then come to believe that he had been given a special authorization by God to kill his buddies. I suppose, given my broad sympathies with the theological views of Scotus and Aquinas, that God really could give such an authorization, somehow, in a manner I can't actually picture to myself. But, assuming God hasn't clued us in to this special command, we're morally and religiously obligated to do all we can to stop him killing his buddies. This sort of what-if scenario misses the broader points which Aquinas and especially Scotus wanted to make in their reflection on this disturbing Bible story. God is the author of nature and of human nature. He set things up, so to speak, filled with naturally discernible standards of right and wrong, and these standards give us a good guide to action, ordered to merely natural ends. But success in achieving these merely natural ends can't get us to our supernatural end, which is to be perfected in the love of God. The Augustinian unity of the ethical and religious life gives us a way of seeing this natural morality as capable of being taken up into a life ordered no longer toward love of self, but to the love of God. But Scotus will add, and here I'll close, still we must recognize that as there is no necessary relationship between success in morality and achieving our ultimate end, God is at liberty to draw us to that end in ways alien to that morality, alien even to the point, as in our story, of being contrary to that morality. Thanks.
If you would maybe turn your chairs a bit, and then that way people can see you, but we have time for questions. Well, thank you. Brad.
I'll just jump right in.
Excellent.
In the absence of Jeffrey Wilson, I guess if you're trying to save SCOTUS from being whipped, I will try to save Kant.
Yay, Brad.
Wouldn't Kant say the following? That you're right insofar as this is what God is doing. And so the moment of faith for Abraham is that Abraham has to be able to grant that although at the moment he cannot discern the rational order of the command must be in some way rational. Because Kant is quite clear that we are never to do anything because another tells us to do it, right? So whether God's doing it is irrelevant to Kant. So you even saying, well, God's right or God's wrong is irrelevant to how Kant would make this judgment. Namely, I am supposed to become the moral law, right? Which is quite Aristotelian through the sift of enlightenment, to say through my own natural lights, right, I can discern the whole of the moral law. That's why the best formulation of the categorical imperative is the autonomy formulation. Am I willing to become the author of the moral law in light of my own reason? And so I think that Kant has an answer, even though you've posed it that way, and it connects to Sartre as well, right? Sartre in Notebooks for Ethics actually says precisely we have morality because of this radical freedom and arbitrary nature. We've got to actually encapsulate that into our own existence. And so I'm just curious, I guess, first of all, how much counter-soccer, or were you just using them kind of as foils? But I think there is something to be said about faith as knowing that there is a reason, which seems to be completely in tandem with people like Scotus, definitely.
Yeah.
I can definitely disagree with Aquinas, the interpretation of Aquinas gives, but I think Scotus is right, and for reasons I think Kant and Sartre wouldn't mind, actually.
A couple of thoughts. So the Kant and Sartre are mostly foils. It seems though that the idea of irrationally legislating some system for oneself, it really is worlds removed from either the purely naturalistic Aristotelianism, which I began, or the theistic Aristotelianism that Aquinas and Scotus are interested in. So I don't think I see as much connection there as you. But let me just, maybe we can talk about that later. The Kant thing, so I don't claim, maybe I should have been clearer about this, that that on Scotus's view, the command is irrational. I mean, after all, the reason turns out to be to radically order your life, Abraham, to the love of God. That's a good reason. So it's rational in that sense, but it's not. But the rationality is in no way discernible through broadly Aristotelian ethical reflection. It transcends the moral system bequeathed to the Middle Ages by Aristotle. And then the final point would be that I fully agree with you that it's really important to the story that Abraham believed that there is some reason, but it seems equally important that that reason be opaque to him. And that's why it becomes a test of faith. So not that this is a good clarification, so not that it's irrational without reason. And so faith is somehow shown in the willingness to do irrational things, but in the inability to find in oneself what the reason might be. And in that sense also it's non-Kantian. I mean, there may come a point when, say, the reason is revealed, and then Abraham would be able to authorize it for himself, but not at that point in the story. I think it's important that Abraham is not a Kantian self-legislator in that moment.
Other question, Elizabeth.
Michael, was your question going to be to Tom? Because mine is actually to Rebecca, and I don't know how we want to.
You go ahead.
Okay. So
Mine is going to be to Rebecca too, but you have one.
Okay. So I would try and ask a question that artfully spoke to both papers, but I'm not capable of that. I've tried it after a long week, so I'm going to stick with one. My question is for Rebecca, and I was wondering in terms of, and I know you focused mainly on certain case studies, but I'm sure that you have a sense both from your previous work and this work of the broader landscape. And I'm wondering, my guess is of course that you see greater cooperation or certain alliances on specific issues, and that there might be greater cooperation on certain sides of the political spectrum than on the other. And I guess I'm partly wondering about that, but I'm also partly wondering at which point the differences work against those alliances, right? So where you might have certain alliances around the death penalty that break down over issues of abortion, and if that maybe is part of the reason that they are such short-term, narrowly focused alliances, that they can't build a broad consensus around life, right?
Right.
Because they don't have the same consensus.
Well, so I'll say the only so I asked everyone about that, and the only consistent issue that they said, we know it was abortion. We know we disagree about these things, and we are absolutely willing to fight to the death on that particular issue, but actually what she was speaking to was that question in this quote, was that, if you're a ridiculous, basically she was like, and everyone said, you're kind of a ridiculous organization if you're not willing to work together and recognize that there's things that you can't work together on, but if you're gonna just say, well, I'm never gonna be able to work with them because we disagree about this one thing, then you're never gonna get anything done. And they actually have a number, so there was literally one thing that they all said they disagreed on, and then like 10 things that they were like, yeah, we all agree about prison reform, we all agree about living wage, we all agree about housing, we all agree about, so there's just this much wider.
But so the alliances you're seeing are mainly on the progressive side of the spectrum.
Well, this was actually so this actually came from everything's all related, but yeah, was looking at the kind of politicized religious left. Mm-hmm. So, and I think, so I have some experience, my first book is on evangelicals, and they're the partnerships with secular organizations would, I think, be more like kind of business relationships maybe, or more kind of, I don't really know, but the religious left basically has no choice except for to partner with secular organizations if they want to make themselves viable, because they're just losing membership. And they recognize that. And so, PICO, LA Voice, you talk to any of the higher up leaders and we're like, we have to figure out something beyond congregational organizing because congregations are dying. And especially everywhere actually, but especially on the left-hand side. And so this is one way to keep this keep the agendas going, keep themselves viable. And I think honestly, like the reason that they don't keep going is they're tired. So it's just really time consuming to do this work. So, you start, and PICO and LA Voice weren't meant to be organizations that do political outreach. They weren't meant to be voter registrating, voter drive, voter GOT, get out the vote organizations. They were meant to be these very community-based, community-focused organizations, and it's really only within the last maybe 10, but really last 6 years that you see PICO focusing on doing this high-level voter engagement and changing what the organization looks like. A lot of people have a lot of problems with it, but that's another part.
Mike?
I was going to ask a much more general question
Sure.
of both of you. So you're both fellows in ACTI, and that's so.
We were
Always
fellows.
You were.
It's just a
Right.
semester long.
Yeah,
Okay,
semester
right,
long.
gotcha. And so this is the result of your work during that time. But you proposed to do that work, and I think we'd all benefit from knowing a little bit more about how you see this work contributing to the auspices of ACTI, the Catholic intellectual tradition, and a little bit about how you got there to this particular project, and you understand this project as an expression of that.
Well, I'll start. So, I see this as part of the larger Catholic social justice mission, and that this work really speaks to how Catholic organizations can be more effective in achieving that. And so, what are the ways that Catholic groups can move beyond their own walls in order to achieve success in reaching out to different groups of people? And so that's why. So I focused on this one because this is sort of where I started, was this political outreach, and then I want to move on to, and I had what I thought was going to be the second part all ready to go, and then things fell apart, but that's qualitative research. So I'm really interested in these secular bonds. How do you as a Catholic organization work with secular groups? What does that mean for your own internal organization? How do you maintain your own Catholic identity and have these partnerships. So that's just off the top of my head, that's my
Yeah, right.
thought.
That's helpful.
Maybe a way of putting it is that if Rebecca's work is looking at the outward focus of the Catholic intellectual tradition, I'm looking inward, looking at these old texts and just trying to understand what it is that this CIT has bequeathed us. I mean, there are tensions in the tradition at a purely intellectual level, and I think it's important that we have people willing to take them seriously and puzzle over them.
Can you say something about conversations between, or, you know, when you were actually doing the writing or even the research, was that very much a part of the fellowship?
No.
No.
Or is that- so,
Yeah.
so I think that was one of the points, you know, for Brian in terms of recommendation, that in terms of presentation, was continuing that in some organized format.
I think that's right. I think there were just the two of us. It was the first
Yeah.
semester. Things were just getting off the ground. I think that it would be really great as the cohorts of fellows expand, that there are more of these kind of public things and the fellows can get together and talk. I mean, I have to say, I tried to prepare this talk for a very well-educated but non-specialist audience, and it was an enormous challenge, but a really good challenge. And I actually had insights that will find their way into the actual published research that I probably wouldn't have gotten if I wasn't trying to think through these things at a more general level.
Just some suggestions in terms of going back to this theme of public scholarship and influencing conversations beyond the fields. So one thing that might be interesting for Rebecca is to look at the 34th and 35th Congregation of the Jesuits, where there's a lot of stuff there about companions in mission and alliances with certain groups and so on, that invite us to, on the one hand, into a conversation with Jesuits in particular, and help us hold them accountable for that being a mutual relationship, which I think has not always happened. So there might be some interesting stuff there. That could become an article in something like Conversations Magazine, which I think would be really productive as another venue to publish in a more reflective style. And for Tom, I would just very much encourage you to publish something in America Magazine that tries to do what you just said, which is to bring a deep intellectual set of tensions and struggles into a public venue for a more generalist audience. And that might in particular inform, not in a preachy way, but inform conversations that are unfolding about, let's say, the death penalty or anything else, based on that particular story, but it might be, I'm sure you look at other stories in relationship to the broader themes that you're looking at. And I promote those particular venues because I think they're widely read in Jesuit higher education, but also because it puts LMU, you know, out front of conversations and showcases the university and the scholarship of our fine faculty. So I always want the other Catholic universities to see how great we are.
Other questions?
I just add as an addendum to Robin's suggestion about looking at those documents from the Jesuit congregations 34 and 35. There will be 36 coming up in a few months, and there may be even further documents there that you can be on top of.
There may be evolution in Jesuits' understanding of the importance of alliance that would be worth, that could inform this push, particularly when you're looking at Catholic organizations.
Well, I think with that, we're adjourned. I want to thank Trini, my graduate assistant, Trini, and Krista Keys, who is also helping out while Kim Peacock is away. So thank you all for setting up and helping us get everything together today. So, thank you.